All right, welcome everybody to DMV Food Recovery Week 2022. Thanks for joining us today. This week, as you may know, is really all about learning easy things you can do at home and ways to support community efforts to reduce food waste and increase food security for all. Thanks to all the amazing sponsors today. If you're here today for intro to composting at home, hot and worm composting, you're in the right place. So welcome. I am going to cover quite a bit in this next hour. So hold on to your seats. Before I get started, I just want to share that we're in the middle of the week. It's actually only Tuesday, right? So there's lots of good programming coming on. I'll touch on this again at the end, but there's a workshop tonight at 6 on various strategies that households can use to prevent food waste. Wednesday at 7, there's going to be a session covering all aspects of food waste policy by a panel. Thursday, we again have 2 events. There's going to be by my colleague Daniela Ochoa Gonzalez, a home composting workshop in Spanish. So if you know of any native Spanish speakers, please encourage them to register for that. And then Thursday night, there's going to be a panel featuring awesome students from Montgomery County, Maryland, and their partners talking about what they're doing. And then Friday, there's going to be a live stream event on Facebook of a no waste big taste food and drink contest among chefs and mixologists from the DC region. So anyway, check those out. All the events are free. Most of them are virtual. There's a few that are in person, so do check those out. Okay, so you are here today to learn about how you can compost at home, and a number of you, when you registered, said you wanted to brush up on composting. Some of you said you loved worms. Yay! So we're going to cover quite a bit. I just want to say a word about the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which is I'm Brenda Platt, by the way, with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and I head up our Composting for Community initiative. I am joined today by my colleague, Megan Matthews, who's going to help with tech stuff, putting in links in the chat, and helping manage all of your awesome questions at the end. So thanks, Megan, in advance. But do check out our website, ilsr.org/composting. We have a lot of resources on composting of all sizes and types. So if some of you are interested in composting at schools or community composting, we have a lot of guides. So check that out. But today, this is what I'm going to cover. I'm going to cover, just so we're on the same page, what is compost and why you might want to compost, some of the benefits, go through some common systems, particularly for home composting, kind of lay out the difference between hot composting and worm composting, also known as vermicomposting, do a little bit of a deep dive on hot composting 101, the ingredients, the recipes, what supplies you might need, how to get started, the importance of moisture, some troubleshooting tips, then of course how to know compost is ready and how to use it. And then I'm going to cover vermicomposting 101, worm composting, and won't be able to do as much as a deep dive on that, but just kind of introduce it and send you to some other resources if you want to learn more. One of the things I'll just tell you right now is I've been doing a lot of training on composting, and I can spend 2 to 3 hours just on hot composting and 2 hours and more just on worm composting. So it's pretty challenging to compress all of this into one workshop today. So you won't learn everything, but you'll learn enough, I think, to set you up for success. At least that's my goal. All right, so what is compost? Well, it's a living soil amendment, but it's not soil. It's a soil enhancer, and it's full of stable plant available nutrients, and it's rich in what we call organic matter. I like to call it black gold. That's me holding up my own black gold that I made in my own backyard. One thing I want to emphasize today is that composting is a biological process, and we want to harness the power of those microbes. Those are your volunteer workhorses. We want to make them happy. So successful composting is all about making those composting microbes happy and giving them what they need. And if we control those certain conditions, then the materials are going to decompose quicker and you'll have the compost faster. So there's many benefits to kind of maximizing the process. Like I said, compost is not soil. It's a soil amendment, and it has so many benefits to the soil. We did, this is part of a poster we did. Megan's going to put the link in the chat if you want to see that poster as well as some of the others, but it kind of visually shows some of the benefits to soil. Compost improves soil tilth, fertility. It helps suppress plant disease. It stimulates root growth. It improves something called cation exchange capacity, which is the ability of soil to retain nutrients. It helps soil retain water, which is, as we're facing so many parts of the country, these severe drought conditions could be the difference between your tomato plant surviving or farmer having their crop survive or not. So the water holding capacity is critical. And even in storm events, as we're having in the mid-Atlantic area, the DC area, it helps prevent soil erosion and that soil from washing away and keeping those plants in place. So many benefits to the fact that adding compost to soil helps increase water holding capacity of the soil, enhances soil structure, supports soil biology. I could probably spend a whole hour just talking about the benefits to the soil. Another driver for composting is waste reduction, right? This is a graphic based on U.S. Environmental Protection Agency statistics, so it's national statistics, not just to the mid-Atlantic area or our city, but on average in the United States, literally about half of what we put on the curb for disposal every week is readily compostable. And this is after recycling, after the fall leaves are collected. This is average for the US, and really, 1/5 is food scraps alone. So it's tremendous. The recycling rate, the tremendous opportunities, and the recycling rate for food scrap still remains about 6% or under nationally. I know this is hard to read, but I just wanted you to know that we have produced this infographic on how composting helps combat climate disruption. So if you're concerned about the climate, composting is a win-win activity that virtually everyone can do. When food scraps end up in a landfill, they contribute to methane emissions. Methane is a highly potent greenhouse gas, especially in the short term. When we're burning our trash in trash incinerators, incineration also produces climate and other pollutants. But when we add compost to the soil and it's providing that critical organic matter, it acts as a carbon sink. And we're storing carbon in the soil. This is why it's a win-win. So in our area, I'm going to pause for a moment for you all to think about is where does your trash go? Do you know? In the DC metro area, we have a lot of incinerators. If you live in the District of Columbia, your trash is most likely being burned in the Lorton incinerator. Same in Montgomery County, Fairfax, Alexandria. Otherwise it's ending up in landfills. So we have a tendency to burn in this area. So this actually just shows the, on the left here, the Baltimore smokestack for the Baltimore incinerator. But what we're talking about here is, do we want to send these resources up in smoke or rotting in a landfill to produce methane, or do we want to produce that black gold and put it back into soil? I hope the answer is produce the black gold. One of the beauties of composting is that there's no one way to do it. It can be large scale, small scale, and literally everything in between. This photo on the top left is the Prince George's County facility in Maryland, which is the largest composting facility in our area that's handling food scraps. I think it's handling about 30,000 tons a year of food scraps. You can also compost on farms. That middle photo on the bottom is on-farm composting of dairy cow manure in Maryland. And the top right photo is a horse manure being composted at a farm in Fairfax, Virginia. And then EcoCity Farms, one of my favorite urban farms in Maryland, is doing worm composting, hot composting, and that's an urban farm. And of course, there's home composting, which is why you're here today. There's also community scale. We do a lot of teaching on how to compost at the community scale. This is our colleague Jeffrey Neal of Loop Closing, based in the DC area, with a Ridan composter that was at the Kelly Miller Middle School in Northeast DC. And then Jordan is at Bliss Meadows, which is in Baltimore, trying these kind of tumblers, the drawer systems. They come in different sizes, they're insulated. So there's just so many options to compost at every scale and keep those food scraps out of the landfill. This is one of my other favorite volunteer-based initiatives. It's in Greenbelt, Maryland, which is in Prince George's County. And they do worm composting. Those are the 3 worm bins on the loading dock of the New Deal Cafe. They also have a few of these 3-bin composting systems in which they do hot composting, and it's all volunteer based, and they're diverting at least 800 pounds a week. So many great examples of composting, not only in our area, but across the country. So where does home composting fit in? We produce this hierarchy, this graphic, if you will, of how to reduce food waste and grow community. So our lens is really local, keeping it local. So of course, we want to reduce food waste from being generated in the first place. That's prevention. Then we want to rescue edible food to feed people, maybe then livestock or animals and chickens and such afterwards. But then, at least from the residential sector, let's promote home composting, then community scale, then large scale. Mixed waste should be last. And of course, landfilling, incineration, we think is the least preferred. So Megan, I think, is going to put the link for that graphic. It is available in different languages and in more detail and as a poster, so check that out. All right, let's get into home composting. Even within home composting, you have so many options. You can build your own system out of wooden pallets. You can build a 3-bin system. There's many designs, do-it-yourself available, wire systems, and you can buy a system. We call these stationary systems because they're not tumblers, you're not turning them. And there's a lot of tumblers on the market. Some have a single chamber, if you will, and some have 2 chambers or dual chambers. One of the things I'll just point out is unlike some of these systems, this is a batch system, meaning if you're using a tumbler and has 1 chamber, you have to let it finish. At some point, you have to stop adding new food scraps and let it finish. And that's why if you do opt for a dual chamber, you can let one side finish while the other one's actively composting. In these systems, you're just flipping or adding to one bin, letting that finish, adding to a second, etc. This stationary system, they usually have a door or a hatch on the bottom here, so you can add at the top and harvest from the bottom. So it's in some ways continuous flow, so you can get away with doing one system. And happy to answer your questions on systems as we go. And you may say, okay, how do I choose? And I hate to give you the answer, it depends, but it does. So how big is your yard, your garden, or your community, if you're at a farm, urban farm? How much, do you have a lot of trees? Are you a gardener? Do you have a lot of garden trimmings? If so, you may want a bigger system and to build it yourself. Do you have a big household? Or are you working at a community site? Are you in a community where you have what I call rat pressure, meaning there are rats in your neighborhood, in your alley? How do you know? Maybe your recycling bin has chew marks, and your trash bin, your recycling bin has holes in it. You see the droppings. So if you have a lot of rat pressure, you do not want to use any of these open systems. You want something that's more enclosed. These stationary systems, you can put hardware cloth underneath it, or sometimes they come with the base, or that is the benefit of a tumbler. They're above ground, they're enclosed. Do you want to have enough volume in your system so that it will get hot? Some of these systems on the market, particularly these tumblers, and if you go to a dual chamber, then it becomes even smaller, or so small that it's really hard to get to the high temperatures. And one of the benefits of hot composting, if you go that route, is that it'll prevent weed seeds from germinating. If there's any risk of pathogens, and I think 2 years in a row, we had a recall of romaine lettuce for a pathogen. So there can be pathogens in what you may be wanting to compost. So reaching high temperatures can help reduce the risk of any of these issues. And but it's harder in a small system, whereas these 3-bin systems or these bigger 80-gallon or larger stationary systems are easier to get hot. The other thing, for those of you who are interested in worm composting, that may be a good option if you don't have a big yard, or you have no yard, or you live in an apartment, or you're a teacher in a classroom and you want a worm bin. And vermicomposting is very different than hot composting, which is why I'm going to break them into, kind of go through them differently today. But that may be a better option for you. There's fewer materials you can put in the bin. Let me just kind of go through some of the basic differences. In hot composting, the goal is to heat up. In worm composting, they like the same temperatures we do. So they don't really like it when it's above 85 degrees Fahrenheit or 90 degrees for sure. So you don't want the bin to heat up. You don't want a lot of volume, because the more volume you have, the more likely it can heat up. So that's one big difference. Vermicomposting utilizes worms and bacteria. It's different microorganisms. There's a wider variety actually in the worm bin. One of the benefits of doing vermicomposting is it's faster. You can have finished compost within 30 days. In hot composting, it's 2 to 6 months, and the longer period it needs to cure, become stable and mature, and that takes time. And it's really 3 to 6 months is the soonest you would have it. 2 months is really pushing it, and that's if you're optimizing all the conditions. It's worm composting, the food scraps and materials ingested by an animal, and it goes through the animal and comes out the other end. So in some ways it's animal husbandry, and you have to take care of your worms. Hot composting, you need to turn the pile in some way, and worms don't like vibrations. They don't like being turned. So some people think they can do worm composting in a tumbler, but that is not how we recommend doing worm composting. In hot composting, you often have to screen out uncomposted pieces. Depending on what you put in the worm bin, you may not need to compost. And the other difference I'll point out is the water content. Moisture is important in both. So that will be something to keep in mind, is that you need to make the microorganisms happy. They need moisture, but a worm bin, the water content is actually a little higher. So hot composting volume is important. Worm composting surface area is important, and I'll talk about that when I get into the worm composting. But those are the basic differences. One thing I want to advise everybody here, whether you're in the DMV area or joining us from around the country, is contact your jurisdiction to see what kind of resources they have for home composting. Some may be giving away bins. Here in Montgomery County, Maryland, they give away this geo bin, which is really great for composting fall leaves and yard waste. The county does not recommend it for food scraps because it's an open system. Right now, they're running pilots on a tumbler, a dual chamber tumbler, as well as one of these stationary systems. So they may be running another phase of the pilot. And if you're interested in getting a bin, go to the website. Megan's putting the link in. You can see where many places you can pick up this system. Greenbelt, Maryland is another jurisdiction in the DMV area, which provides home composting bins, worm bins, as well as these hot stationary bins. And they're not for free, but they're at a reduced price. It's $30, I think, which is like, they're normally retail for over $100. So it's quite a deal. So check out what your local government is doing. In the District of Columbia, the Department of Public Works has a home composting training and rebate program, and that is based on the City of Austin's program, where they offer a rebate up to $75 off the cost of a bin if you take one of the DPW sponsored 2-hour workshops. So this workshop doesn't qualify you for the rebate. You need to take a 2-hour one, and you can qualify for a worm bin or the hot composting bin. So check out your local jurisdiction and see what they offer. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into kind of hot composting 101 and what are the key steps and ingredients for success. And I really like to start with the microbes because there are so many diverse organisms that thrive in the compost pile at different points of the process. And some we can see with our eyes. Those are the microorganisms. Those are the macroorganisms, the one we can see with our eyes. And the ones that we can't see, those are kind of the microorganisms. They're too small to see with the naked eye. And those are like the bacteria, the fungi or molds, and the actinomycetes. So these are what we call the first level decomposers or first level consumers, and they're really kind of feeding and beginning to break down our food, kitchen scraps and those other organic residues. And they really thrive in a compost pile. And as they consume the materials, the pile heats up. That's where the heat in the compost pile comes from. It's not from the sun. A lot of people think, oh, I need to put my compost bin, in the sun. The shade is fine. And if you're doing worm composting outside, you absolutely need to put your bin in the shade. As your pile cools, it becomes inhabited by common soil microorganisms, so protozoa, worms, mites, insects, and then other larger organisms are feeding on them and on the organic matter. And those are the second and third degree decomposers. And the compost process, again, it's like teeming with this life. Now, the conditions in the pile can change as the composting process proceeds, but it's this diversity of life that really helps the process continue. And these are your volunteer workhorses. So your job is to really make them happy. And the way to do that is to know about what food they like to consume. That it's really important to understand that composting is an aerobic process, meaning it needs oxygen, it needs air. It's when the process has gone anaerobic, where there's no oxygen in the pile, that you might tend to get smells. So if you're getting air in your pile, these microbes need oxygen, you're paying attention a little bit to the water. I don't water my pile that often. One of the benefits of composting with food scraps is food scraps have a lot of moisture in them. So that helps bring moisture into the pile. But sometimes and I'll give you some tricks, techniques for how to monitor the water. But just like us, the composting microbes need these things to survive. Now, the greens and browns, you may be familiar a little bit with these terms, but what greens and browns are, these are greens refer to materials that are generally rich in nitrogen, and browns refer to materials that are generally relatively high in carbon. We live on a carbon-based planet, so everything has some amount of carbon in it. And we also generally, all living things need about 25 to 30 times more carbon. That's on a chemical element basis, a dry basis. Go back to your chemistry class, think about the elements of carbon, but we generally need 25 to 30 times more carbon than nitrogen. And so that's what these microbes need. Humans need that too. But when we're talking about browns, you're talking about your fall leaves. Fall is here, the leaves are falling. Grab those leaves. Don't put any at the curb. You will need them all year round to compost with your greens, your food scraps. Oops, sorry about that. Other browns could be wood chips, clean wood chips. Maybe you have some woody stalks from your plants, and it doesn't have to be like, kale or produce that you're growing. It could be, you have daylily stalks or something like that. Greens tend to be your food scraps. This is supposed to be coffee grounds, maybe hard to see. Green leaves, if you have dried flowers, a lot of that can be a mix because there's some stalks, but the green things, tea bags are fine, and the paper for the coffee filters are fine to put in. One thing I think that's helpful to think about is think about browns as things that don't rot easily. So you can store them and they're not going to get nasty and smelly. And think of anything as greens as things that, have more liquid. If they're standing around in a bucket or a pail, they're going to release liquid. They're going to get smelly. So those are your nitrogen rich materials. Okay. So a general guideline is in order to get that 25 to 30 times more elements of carbon than elements of nitrogen, again, that's on a dry chemical basis, the general guideline for you is you want, by volume, by material, 2 to 3 times more browns than greens. So sometimes people run into problems when they're composting. They put a lot of food scraps or grass clippings, but they're not adding enough browns. And what happens is if you have too much nitrogen in your compost pile, that excess nitrogen is converted to ammonia, and then you can run into odor issues. So you never want more food scraps than browns. You should always have brown materials on hand and ready to use, which is why I'm advising keep all those fall leaves. Okay, so this is your general guideline. Okay, now let's go through what materials are acceptable or not acceptable for home composting. If you're lucky enough to have curbside collection of food scraps and it's going to like a commercial facility, they may accept different materials. So this is what these charts really is what we recommend for home composting, particularly if you're just starting out and you don't have a lot of experience with this. When in doubt, leave it out. So for your greens, those are going to be your fruit and vegetable scraps. Eggshells count, coffee grounds, paper filters, tea bags, rip off the staples, no plastic tea bags, some of your green garden trimmings. The browns, again, your fall leaves, your plant stalks, wood chips and shavings, make sure it's not chemically treated. You can put a little bit of paper in there, like if you have brown bags, a little bit of shredded newspaper, but you want to make sure to rip it up, and that cannot be your only carbon source. I strongly advise leaving out cooked food, anything with oil or grease, meat, fish, bones. These materials increase the risk of attracting rodents. They tend to have more odor attracted to it. One thing I'll say is that rodents cannot thrive off just fruit and vegetable scraps alone. They need a balanced diet that includes protein. So deny them that protein. Don't put the meat, dairy, and cooked human food, which they love, in your home composting pile. Take out the contaminants. I cannot seem to train my own family to remove those produce stickers. You can pick them out afterwards or screen them, but it's nice to prevent the contamination. Also highly recommend leaving out pet waste, kitty litter. They, especially pets that eat meats, have a high likelihood of their pet waste containing pathogens. Cats have toxoplasmosis. It's prevalent in cat feces and can be extremely infectious. So don't compost pet waste, especially if you are new to composting or you plan to use your compost to grow edible plants. Leave out treated painted wood, glossy paper. They can have contaminants. As a general rule, I recommend avoid putting in diseased or poisonous plants or aggressive weeds. If you keep weeding it from your garden, don't put it in your compost. I have herbicide treated plants here because certain herbicides, particularly those that are persistent herbicides, will persist through the composting process. So, try to leave those out. I also recommend avoiding dryer lint because some of our clothes are no longer made of natural materials, so we don't want to introduce microplastics or synthetic materials into the compost. Use tissues we added during COVID. That's a personal preference, especially for a home composter. People don't really want to be handling someone else's used tissues, but, I would say just really teach your housemates, when in doubt, to leave it out, your housemates and your family. I just want to say a word about, there's a lot of products in food serviceware now that either say compostable or look like they are made out of compost materials. And many of those products that might be labeled as compostable are not designed to break down in home composting systems. So I would say be wary of those. You can you know, these two products look like they're compostable, but this one on the right is coated with plastic and it's not labeled as compostable. So just because it looks like it's compostable doesn't mean you should put it in your bin. Generally, you can look for this logo, which means it's a third-party certified, and it may say commercially compostable only, but at least you'll know it's not coated in, you know, like regular plastic. Okay. All right. So moisture is critical. It should be between 45 to 60% moisture. If it's too dry, our microbes are going to go dormant. If it's too wet, they're going to drown. And then those nice air pockets in our pile that we need will fill with water. And then it'll lead to those anaerobic type conditions. So we teach this, what we call the hand squeeze test. So when you're first building your pile, you know, grab a mix of your recipe, your mix of nitrogen and your greens and your browns, and squeeze it. If you get just a few drops of water between your knuckles, that's perfect. If you open it and it kind of clumps together, that's also good. If you open it and it's kind of dry, you get no water drops, it's too dry. We also call this the armpit test. So if you were to hold it up and it drips into your arm, that's too wet too. So, you know, some people say it should feel like a wrung out sponge a little bit, but 50% moisture, I mean, that's half the weight of your pile is moisture. So it's a lot of moisture. One of the secrets to composting is oxygen, no matter what size you're doing it, from small to large scale. You're going to need to get oxygen in the pile at some point, and turning it has some benefits besides charging the material with fresh air. It helps distribute that moisture, the nutrients, the organisms, breaks up clumps of material, it invigorates and provides that burst of microbial activity. So turning the pile when you can is a good thing. You don't want to do it every day, because then you're releasing the heat and you want it to kind of break down. And I'll show you a chart in a few minutes. It kind of shows you the impact of the frequency of turning. And just be aware of blocking airflow. You want to get that chimney effect in your pile, where it's drawing cool air from the bottom and hot air rises, that flow of oxygen. So you don't want it too dense. You don't want it light and fluffy. But you want some air pockets in there. And in the longer course that we teach, we go through the importance of density, which I don't have time today. But sometimes small branches and plant stems at the bottom, you know, can create that avenue for the air to come in. And if you're adding wet leaves this fall, just break up those mats. You know, you don't want a layer of cardboard or wet leaves that prevents air from flowing. So keep that in mind. One thing I really like to emphasize is that you can home compost at whatever level of effort you would like to do it at. You don't need to be tracking temperatures if you don't want to, but you can get a temperature probe if you want to geek out. There's many available. And it is good to know that if you aren't optimizing conditions for your microbes, the process is going to be slower, and your system will fill up faster because the materials aren't breaking down as quickly, right? So hot composting is quicker. Again, it can take anywhere from 2 to 5 months. 6 months is good, but if you're doing more passive or cold composting, it can actually take a year. And as I said before, the other benefits of hot composting is you reduce the risk of pathogens, you're killing those weed seeds, and by turning or remixing, you're creating, you know, that room for the air to permeate the pile and reinvigorate the microbial activity, which is what you want. But just know you can do low effort. It's fine. And if you don't want the weed seeds to persist, then don't put them in to begin with. Here's that chart I promised to show you, which shows the temperature. And hot composting is really anywhere above from 120 to 160. So in the first 2 to 3 weeks, if you're turning every 3 days, you know, you're going to speed the composition. It'll be, you know, you can do it 6 to 8 weeks. But if you're turning every 10 days, you know, you'll still be doing well. It's just going to take longer, every 30 days. But just know composting is a very, very forgiving process, hot composting anyway. All right, you may ask what kind of basic supplies you need, you know, how are you going to collect your kitchen scraps. If you're not using a tumbler, you may want a pitchfork. If you have one, it's fine. But if you're going to buy one, buy a manure fork or a compost fork that has curved tines and more pointy tines. You need a source of water. Face mask we were recommending because as you're turning your pile, you can get airborne what's known as bioaerosols, that fungi. And so you don't want to be breathing it in. If you've got any respiratory issues, wear a mask, particularly for turning the pile, for screening compost if you're going to do that. You don't need a temperature probe, but, it can be helpful. Cutting, your tomato stalks and stuff, some shears are good. You don't need a screener, but it can be good if you're particularly putting like pineapple tops or wood chips or things like that in your pile. So size does matter. I would say, if you don't want to chop your corn cobs, you don't need to, but it's going to take a much longer time to break down. It's all surface area, right? So if you've got your corn cob chopped in 4 pieces, there's just more surface area for the microbes to work and break down. Okay, so remove the stickers and staples. Then you've got your bin, you're coming out to your backyard. In this scenario, there's a stationary system, but I've used one of these geo bins like Montgomery County, Maryland gives out for free. And I store my leaves, my browns in here. So when I come out, I'm ready to dump my food scraps and then add 2 to 3 times more leaves. So you want to set up your browns convenient to your compost system. Okay. Here's some basic troubleshooting tips. And by the way, you'll have a link to the slides. If Megan hasn't already put it in the chat, you'll get a link to download, so you'll have some of this information. But if the compost has a bad odor, too much, maybe there's too much nitrogen, not enough air, add carbon. Your browns, turn the pile. If it's too dry, moisten, turn. If it's damp, but it's still not heating up, maybe your pile's too small. Collect more material, mix it into the pile. If it's damp, but it's still not heating up, especially this is going to happen in the winter, you can compost year round. Maybe it needs a little bit more boost of nitrogen. So, coffee grounds, some grass clippings, if you have them, can help. Just a little bit more nitrogen. So let's say your compost is ready to be harvested. It's looking like this black gold. You can either harvest it from the bottom, or for this system, you can kind of lift it up and move it. Harvest the bottom, then put what's not broken down on the top back in the system and start again. How do you know when your compost is finished? Well, it has that nice crumbly, loose, humus-like, feel to it. It's dark in color. It contains no readily recognizable food scrap. Sure, you may have a pineapple top or an avocado pit and the like, but you shouldn't see a banana peel or things like that. And it's 1/3 of its original volume. It's like magic. It just shrinks and shrinks. You think your bin's full, you keep adding and it disappears. Screening, if you use wood chips or you want to get rid of, some of the stuff, you can get hardware cloth, 1/4 inch is good, can be sharp when you cut it. This is just a simple thing over a bucket. Me screening, compost. And you can see here some seeds, avocado pit, mango pit. I just think you could put that back in. So, and there's the black gold screened. I was lucky my husband's handy built me this screener that fits over a wheelbarrow. So easy, does a little bit more volume. You'll have this in the handout, the PDF of the slides. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this right now, but using compost, just know you can incorporate it into the soil. You can use it as a mulch. You can use it as a potting mix. Lots of ways to use compost. I want to say a word about rodents, since a lot of us are in urban areas, and we have this new guide we call O-Rats, How to Avoid Rodents at Community Composting Sites. Great tips for home composters too. Rodents can carry diseases, as we know. And one thing I like to share with people is that one healthy female Norway rat, the type that thrives in our area, can have 84 offspring in 1 year. So that is exponential growth. So you really, do need to if you have rodent problems, is beat back those populations. There's some tips in there. There's some rat academies you can take. But here's for home composters some 9 tips to avoid rodents and other unwanted critters like raccoons and possums. So again, no meat, no dairy, no oil, no cooked food. You want to incorporate all bits of food well into the pile. Don't leave anything exposed or visible. Cover with that thick layer of leaves or the other browns. Rodents love clutter and they don't like open space. Think like a hawk. They don't like their predators, right? So if you maintain space around your bin, your browns, and your system, they won't like it. A lot of people put it right up against a fence, but don't do that. One of the benefits of being an active composter and turning is rodents like places that are not disturbed and don't give them an opportunity to form a habitat. If you're doing a bin system, you can put hardware cloth and stake it out underneath. And if you have the space, moving your system around, again, rodents like places that are undisturbed. So there's some tips. In terms of getting started, locate your bin. Convenient to you, the water source, you need room to move around. Make sure it's not in a rain event, not standing water. Set up your storage for browns, where you're going to keep your tools, your kitchen pail. You want to create that base of more open material to create that airflow. Build your pile. As it heats up, it's going to drive off moisture, so you may need more. Do your hand squeeze test. The earliest you can have finished compost is like this 2 to 3 months. Letting it cure is better. Screening is optional. And then you can just start again. So I want to leave some time for questions. And I know we only have about less than 20 minutes left. So I'm going to zip through the worm composting, vermicomposting very quickly here for you, just to get a sense of how different this is. And as I said at the beginning, vermicomposting relies on earthworms. It's somewhat animal husbandry. It's more surface area rather than volume. And a lot of the vermicomposting bins, sorry about that, that you see are based on surface area, okay? But the benefits of this black gold are tremendous. It's the compost itself is this high surface area, higher water holding capacity, higher nutrient holding capacity. I mean, you get accelerated germination, accelerated seedling growth, early flowering, more plant available nutrients, plant growth hormones. So regular compost is amazing, but vermicomposting is like, wow, like it's terrific stuff. I want to point you to a really great resource is Rhonda Sherman, who has taught me most everything I know about worm composting, is with the North Carolina State Extension. She has an amazing website, including some pages on vermicomposting for households, how to set up your worm bin, how to troubleshoot. So Megan put the link in the chat. So check that out for more information. What I want to share with you today is some basics. And one of the things I find astounding is that there are more than 9,000 species of earthworms that have been identified, but of those, only 7 species are good for vermicomposting. So you have to use the correct species for worm composting. And there are many categories of worms, and scientists have divided earthworms into these 3 basic different categories depending on what they like to eat and where they live. So the epigeic worms, they don't live in soil. They live on top. They're kind of what they call litter dwellers. So they live under piles of leaves or in a cow pasture under the cow manure patties, if you want to call them that. They do not burrow. Okay, so this is why you can't go into your backyard and just harvest any earthworm and think you can use it for worm composting. You cannot. We need the epigeic type worms. The other worms, the aniseic and the endogeic, live in soil and they burrow either horizontal or extensive. So those are not what we want. We want the epigeic. And the number one species of worms used around the world for vermicomposting, and the Latin name is Icenia fetida, often called red wigglers, but you really, if you're ordering online, you want to use the Latin name, okay? They respond to a wider variety of environmental conditions. They breed, they move in captivity, and so, but be careful about, internet sellers. Counting worms is not fun, so I recommend that you always start with at least 1 pound, which is about 1,000 worms of this species. And for every square foot of surface area of bin, you want to add 1 to 2 pounds of worms. They eat 25 to 35% of their body weight daily, okay? So a quarter to a third of their body weight. And anyway, prices vary. You do want to get it from a reputable worm dealer. All right, so how much food scraps can you feed your worms? So if you have 1 pound of worms, how many food scraps can you give them a day? Well, only a quarter to a third of a pound of food scraps, right? Because they only eat that much a day. If you give them more, the rest of that food is just going to rot in your bin. If you have 2 pounds of worms, then they can eat half a pound of fruit and vegetable scraps a day. So just keep this in mind. They will propagate. You'll get more worms. So over time, you can start with 1 pound and you'll be able to feed more food scraps, okay? You can make your own bin. Like this is like Rubbermaid with holes. Rhonda Sherman on her website has steps for how to do that, or you can buy ready-made worms, worm bins, worm compost. Again, they're trays where you can, the way they're designed is you put the food scraps in one tray in the bedding, and the worms eat it. And then when that looks like it's being done, then you stop feeding and you start feeding in the tray above, and the worms go through these holes. You don't have to pick them out. They just travel up, okay? You can also build your own, be creative. These are some I've seen around. I love these benches where they double as a worm bin. If you open, these are 2 different benches, not even the same one. I saw this was a repurposed bathtub, which I loved. So you can build your own. Okay, so they need to live in bedding. This is a good time actually with the fall leaves. You can use fall leaves but ripped newspaper or brown paper bag. If you order a bin, you can, often it comes with this brick of coconut fiber coir. It's not native to our area, so, I don't often recommend it, but it's great. Ripped cardboard. You do need to soak the bedding and drain the water before adding to the bin. They like that moisture, and you never, ever want to pour water into your worm bin. So once you order your worms, they'll come packed in like this, and you don't need to pick them out. Worms don't like light. They will become paralyzed by light. So you can just gently drop them in the top of the bin, cover the bin open, and they'll move away from the light. You don't need to help them. Helping or touching them will only tear their delicate skins. They breathe through their skins, which is why they need that moisture. So if you let them dry out, they're gonna die, okay? But if you've ever, after a rain event, seen the worms on the sidewalk or in the road, and you wonder why aren't they crawling back to the grass or, plant life where they can live, the soil, it's because they're paralyzed. So maybe you will become like me and pick up earthworms and flick them into where there's soil. There's on our website, we have other places where you can buy worms. We make no money, by the way. We don't get any commissions off any of the sites, but I do want to send you to some sites that pack them well and have good worms, and this is just one of them. So what do they eat? They're a little bit more picky. So they don't like citrus. They don't like very salty or sugary foods. They don't like anything in the onion family. So garlic, onion, leeks, hot peppers are not good. Some of the same stuff that was on the other list. I tend not to put like my, pistachio shells and olive pits because nothing will happen. That will go in the hot composting outside. But they love fruit and vegetable scraps, not citrus, as I said. They love banana peels. They love melon rinds. Eggshells are okay. The coffee grounds are okay. So, but I call them my princesses. They're a little bit pickier. So they don't have teeth, so I tend to chop things a little bit more for them. If you have broccoli stalks that are tough, they are not gonna, and you put broccoli, this is a great science project with kids, by the way. You could put broccoli stalks on one side and chopped, strawberries or bananas on another, and the worms are great communicators. You will see they are not eating the broccoli stalks, they are eating the other stuff. Again, vermicomposting is all about surface area. So you want to add you have your bedding, you have your worms, you want to add your food scraps in a thin layer, not more than 2 inches. They live, these epigeic worms, the Incinerators, live in the top 3 to 6 inches. So you don't want to bury your food scraps. Remember, they rise up to eat, and then they will eat new food scraps as they're added. So one of my tips is wait until all food scraps are eating before piling more on top. At least if you feed on one area, wait till that's gone, you can feed on the other area. Because if you pile too much up, the food waste at the bottom is just going to rot and smell, and they will not eat it. You also always want to cover the food scraps and never leave any food scraps exposed. So there's different techniques for harvesting the worm compost. Again, it's pretty easy if you buy one of these systems. There's also light separation. This is me making a pile. The worms will go, to the bottom, and you can kind of pick the top off. And at the end, you'll combine piles, and at the end, you'll be left with all the worms, and you can start a new bin. So that's kind of a quicker method, but there's more resources. So this is basically my last slide, and then we'll spend the last 10 minutes taking your questions, but just some hints. Hot composting, stockpile those browns. The recipe is important. Beware of the popular bins. They are often too small to get hot, and you need time to cure the compost. With vermicomposting, you don't turn the bin, feed smaller pieces, always wait until the food is consumed. And I've kind of highlighted, always cover food scraps. Nobody likes to open their compost bin and have fruit flies fly into your face, or see maggots in your pile. It's not terrible for the composting system, but you really, just by covering your food scraps, you avoid some of those nuisance problems. And now we will open it for questions. I'll just say that if you're not thinking home composting is not for you, you may be in an area with a drop-off site. DC has them, Greenbelt, Maryland has them. I think Alexandria has drop-off sites. Increasingly, where Falls Church has them. The DC Department of Parks and Recs has this community compost cooperative network where you can join, take a 1-hour training, and then you can drop off your food scraps 24/7. Basically, there's a map. You can see which one is close to you. And if you don't want to go to a food scrap drop-off site, another option in our area is you may be able to subscribe to a food scrap collection service, and there are a growing number of those. Compost Crew, Compost Cab, Veteran Compost. O-Scrap is a fairly new entree into the field. So there's my contact information, our email, more resources. And since pumpkin season is here, we have some tips for composting your pumpkins too. All right, Megan, let's see what I can do in 8 minutes with questions.
All right. We have a few questions in the Q&A. 2 of them I answered during the talk. One was recommendations for containers, and I shared some links. I think everyone should be able to see those links in the Q&A. And we also had a question about systems for indoor use, which I said vermicomposting can be good for that. But Brenda, if you have other suggestions for indoor use.
Yeah, I mean, generally hot composting is something you do outside, okay? I mean, that you can do it inside, like a garage, or shed, but generally it's something you do outside. Worm composting is a good option for inside, I think. And the other thing I'll just say with the links is, being with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, we encourage you to support your local hardware stores and brick and mortar stores. You may think Amazon is cheaper, than Home Depot or other things. It is not always cheaper. And Amazon, we actually have a big anti-Amazon campaign at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. So if you want to know about the downsides to supporting Amazon, go check that out.
Great. We also had a question about someone has a big walnut tree in their backyard, and they've heard that walnut leaves can make the compost become an herbicide if they get in it. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm glad somebody asked this. So some trees do produce acids that inhibit plant growth or are toxic to microbial life, and black walnuts trees do make that list. So if the only tree in your backyard is a black walnut tree, that you are going to run into some issues of that being your dominant source of the leaves. But walnuts in general are fine. That's not going to be your only carbon source. If you've got pine needles, things like that, we generally recommend that you don't have like pine needles or walnuts be like more than 10% by volume of what you're putting in your pile. So diversity is good. In California, they have to contend with like eucalyptus trees and junipers and cypress. We're a little bit more lucky where we are.
Great. And for eggshells, do you have to rinse them before they go in the pile?
You do not. Grit in worm composting, the worms have gizzards, and so they need a little grit. And so with the eggshells, it is helpful to kind of crush them a little bit. If you put a whole half an eggshell in your worm bin, you'll find them often nestling in there, but it won't break down. So sometimes I even run a jar or a rolling pin, over dry eggshells to really pulverize it for the worm bin. But, otherwise I just, you can crush the eggshells in the hot bin, or as you're turning a pile, if you see an eggshell, you can just grab it with your gloved hand or not and just crush it a little bit. But I never rinse my eggshells.
Cool. And bunny waste, so poo and urine soaked shavings, is that okay to go in the compost?
If you're just starting out, I would say leave out all the pet waste. Now, these are herbivores, so their waste doesn't have the same pathogens that like kitty litter and dog poop has, but you still want to reach 131 degrees for at least 3 days straight to reduce the risk of pathogens. We go into the temperatures in more detail in our longer course. And so I would say keep it out and see if you can reach those high temperatures, 131 degrees for 3 days. If you're able to optimize the conditions, the carbon, nitrogen, the moisture, the pile's big enough, you have enough volume, you've got enough air going in, you should be able to reach that temperature. The smaller tumblers are a little bit harder. I think even larger tumblers can be hard. It's hard to get the air in there. So just think about, if you're always closing the hatch and just the little holes, they get clogged, you're not getting enough oxygen. So think about, is there a trowel or some short shovel you can get in there to fluff the inside of a tumbler? And that might help you get high temperatures. And the moisture is really important. And then if you're reaching 131 degrees, then I say guinea pigs, rats, even not rats, why did I say rats? Rabbits. And even if you have a chicken coop and you're growing chickens, you can put your chicken manure in there too. But really, I think you want to do the hot composting, not the passive cold for that.
Great. And then we have a couple questions about 3-bin systems. So how long does it take to turn a pile in a 3-bin system? And about how many pounds of food scraps can go into one pile of a 3-bin system?
Ooh, we have some community garden sites that have there's different designs. So some of the pictures I showed, like the Greenbelt Compost Cooperative, there's a 4-foot cubes. There's also 3-foot cubes. And I would say you want at least 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet to get it hot. They work so well. I love 2- and 3-bin systems, by the way, because it's so much easier to get it hot. But those community garden sites, I think some of them are handling like 200 pounds of food waste a week in there. So they can handle quite a bit. and a lot of yard waste too. So I have been trying out different systems. That 80-gallon stationary system, it's about 80-gallon. There's a number of them, the Free Garden Earth, the Earth Machine. Those, I have a family of 4. I maybe empty it twice a year because you
Okay.
keep adding and it keeps breaking down.
Mhm.
So an average household is like 10 pounds a week of food scraps, by the way, depending on the size of your household.
And how long does it take to turn? And how often do you have to stir the whole
It,
pile?
it's really up to you. It's what kind of effort you want to put into it. I mean, if you really want to see if you can get hot, then turn it more frequently. But a lot of the community garden sites, I mean, they're not flipping from bin 1 to bin 2, except for once a month. So it's a personal preference. And I really just say, do what makes sense. But if you are a dump and run person, just make sure your food scraps are covered. Don't just dump your food scraps on top. I know we're at time, and I'm sorry I didn't get to all your questions. You can feel free to email us, the DC Home Composting .org. I just want to quickly do a plug. We have a number of events tonight at 6 p.m., a session covering all aspects of food policy. There's going to be a panel of representatives from DC, Maryland, Virginia, and they're going to talk about that. Thursday, we have 2 events. Again, a hot composting workshop in Spanish. And then in the evening, these students are doing amazing work. So support them. And then on Friday, it's going to be a live stream on Facebook of a no waste, big taste food and drink contest among chefs and mixologists from the DC region. And they're going to be using a mystery basket of recovered food and ugly produce. So that should be fun. And then finally on Saturday, if you're DC local, we have an in-person tour of 4 restaurants in the H Street Northeast corridor in DC, each of which have won a grant for food waste innovation from DC's Department of Small and Local Business Development. So by joining this tour, you're going to have an opportunity to meet some key stakeholders as well as enjoy food and drink. So that's Pursuit Wine Bar, it's Sticky Fingers Diner, Greenville Moors, and Pie Shop. So if any of these are of interest, please go to the website. Megan's going to put the link in there and check that out. And hope this this workshop was useful to you. So happy composting. Keep all those fall leaves. So starve a landfill. Feed your community and help prevent climate disruption. Thank you. Thanks, Megan.